I was 29 when the world ended. Or at least, that's how it felt when Ryan died. One moment, I had a husband, a future, a child who hadn't yet been conceived but was already real in our whispered plans. The next moment, I was a widow in a quiet house, standing in the doorway, waiting for footsteps that would never come. The pain was unbearable, so I did what people do when they can't bear pain. I ran from it. I packed my grief into a suitcase and carried it with me to a place where I thought it couldn't follow. A monastery. I had never been particularly religious, though Ryan was. He used to pray before bed, his voice low and steady, as if speaking to an old friend. I would listen with my eyes closed, not believing, but loving the sound of him believing. The monastery was silent. Silence was what I wanted. No reminders of Ryan, no questions from well-meaning friends who told me I was young, that I would love again. I didn't want to love again. I wanted the world to stop. And for 40 years it did. I won't speak of life in the monastery because, truly, what is there to say? The days passed in quiet repetition, one bleeding into the next. I prayed, though I wasn't sure to whom. I worked in the gardens. The others treated me kindly, but kindness did not pierce the thick cocoon of my grief. I did not seek friendship, nor did I offer it. The monastery was meant to be a place of healing, but I did not heal. I merely existed. And then there was Father Richard. He was young when I arrived, perhaps in his early 30s, though he carried himself with the stillness of someone much older. He had sharp, intelligent eyes that softened when he spoke to the sisters, though there was always something beneath the surface. A weight he did not share. I first noticed his attention in small moments. A hesitation before he spoke my name. The way his gaze lingered longer than it should. The slight inclination of his head when I passed, as if he were listening for something only I could say. At first, I dismissed it. I was not young, not beautiful, not the sort of woman men noticed. I had been a wife, but in my mind, I was still a widow. A woman bound to a ghost. But Richard noticed me. I remember the first time he spoke to me alone. It was late autumn, the air crisp with the scent of burning wood. I had stayed behind in the chapel after evening prayers, my knees stiff from kneeling too long. When I rose, he was there, standing just beyond the candlelight. "You pray as if you're searching for something," he said. I turned to him, startled. "Isn't that the purpose of prayer?" His lips quirked into something that was not quite a smile. Some pray to be heard. Others pray to hear something in return. I did not answer. He stepped closer, his voice quiet. "Do you hear anything, Sister Ada?" His use of my name made me uneasy. The other priests addressed me formally, without warmth or familiarity. But Richard was not like the others. He was younger, yes, but it was more than that. There was something restless about him, something that did not belong within these walls. "I don't know what I'm listening for," I admitted. He studied me, his expression unreadable. Maybe that's the problem. I should have walked away then. I should have folded my hands and offered him the practiced, pious response he was expecting. But something in his voice, something in the way he looked at me, kept me rooted to the stone floor. And that was the beginning. Over the years, Richard and I never spoke of anything forbidden. And yet, there was an unspoken understanding between us, a thread that pulled tight whenever we were near. A glance held a second too long. A touch that lasted just past the point of propriety. I told myself it was nothing, that I had imagined it. But there were nights when I lay in my small cell, staring at the ceiling, and I knew. He saw me. Not as a nun, not as a widow, but as a woman. And for the first time in 40 years, I began to feel like one. The night it began, the air was thick with summer heat, pressing against the stone walls of the monastery like an unspoken confession. The candles in the corridor flickered, their flames bending as if they, too, were witnesses to something that should not have been. Father Richard had been walking through the halls, his thoughts clouded by something he could not name, when he heard it, soft footsteps in the room that belonged to me. I should have been asleep. He hesitated outside my door. his fingers tightening into a fist as if waging a silent war with himself. But something, perhaps fate, or something darker, urged him forward. He stepped inside without knocking. I did not startle. It was as if I had been waiting for him. The room was dimly lit, a single candle burning on the wooden table near my bed. I stood by the window, the moonlight casting a pale glow over my face. The fabric of my night robe was thin, my bare feet cold against the stone floor. We did not speak at first. He closed the door behind him, the soft click of the latch filling the space between us. I should have told him to leave. I should have crossed my arms, turned away, pretended I did not feel what I felt. But instead, I held his gaze. "You shouldn't be here," I whispered. "And yet I am," he murmured back, his voice quiet, careful. "Something told me to come. Something." We both knew what it was. He took a slow step toward me, and I saw the way his eyes searched my face, as if looking for something he had not dared to seek before. "How did you end up here, Ada?" he asked. His voice was rougher than usual, edged with something that did not belong within these walls. I lowered my gaze, my fingers twisting together. "You already know." "I know what they say," he countered. "That you lost your husband. That you sought solace in this place. But I don't believe that's the whole truth." My breath caught. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A woman like you, a beautiful, kind woman," he exhaled sharply, as if struggling against the words, "should be loved, should be touched, should be someone's, Ada." The air between us turned heavy. "Richard," I murmured. I had never spoken his name like that before. Not as Father Richard. Just Richard. A man, not a priest. His throat bobbed with a hard swallow. "Say it again," he said, stepping closer. I shouldn't have. I should have turned my face away, pretended this moment had not been written in the stars long before we ever met. "Richard," I breathed. Something in him shattered. He reached for me before I could think, before I could stop him. His hands found my arms, sliding down to my wrists, his touch firm but hesitant, as if waiting for me to resist. I did not. I started, but I did not know how to finish. "What do you need?" His voice was low, desperate. I looked up at him, feeling as though I was standing on the edge of something vast, something from which there would be no return. "Just hold me," I whispered. A muscle in his jaw tensed, his breath uneven. He hesitated, even then, even when everything inside us was screaming for more. But then, finally, he pulled me into his arms. It was meant to be innocent. A simple embrace. Something to ground me, to calm the storm inside me. But the moment his arms closed around me, the moment my face pressed against his chest, I knew. This was not comfort. This was not solace. This was surrender. My fingers curled into the fabric of his robe, my body molding to his as if I had been made for this. His heart was hammering against my cheek, a frantic rhythm that matched my own. "God help me," he whispered, his lips brushing against my hair. "I can't let go." I didn't ask him to. I lifted my head, and in the dim candlelight, I saw it in his eyes, the same war raging inside me, the same need, the same hunger. He lifted a hand to my face, his fingertips grazing my cheek as if I were something fragile, something sacred. And then he kissed me. It was slow, hesitant at first, as though he still thought he might stop himself. But when I melted into him, when my fingers tangled in his hair, he gave in. The weight of 40 years unraveled in that kiss. I had forgotten what it was to be touched, to be wanted. The way a man's hands felt against my skin, the way his breath could steal mine. The way desire curled low in my stomach, turning my limbs weak. Richard pressed me against the wall, his forehead resting against mine, his breath uneven. "Tell me to leave," he whispered. "Tell me to stop." But I couldn't. "I don't want you to," I admitted. A quiet, broken sound left him. He kissed me again, deeper this time, his hands sliding down my waist, gripping as if to anchor himself. My body was on fire, trembling beneath his touch, and still, it was not enough. And yet, somehow, we pulled back before we lost ourselves completely. We stood there breathless, our hands still tangled in each other's robes. The night stretched between us, thick with longing and something dangerously close to love. "This can't happen," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I nodded, but I did not let him go. "Then why does it feel like it was always meant to?" I asked. He had no answer. For now, it was our secret. For now, the nights were ours. And in the darkness, we became something we could never be in the light. The first time Richard asked me to walk with him outside the monastery, I hesitated. It was not forbidden, not truly. There were no strict rules against walking through the gardens or venturing into the fields beyond the stone walls. But it was the way he asked, the quiet urgency in his voice, that made it feel like something we should not do. He came to me in the late afternoon, when the sun was beginning to lower itself into the horizon, turning the sky into strokes of gold and rose. I was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, my hands buried in the earth. I had spent years tending to this land, coaxing life from it with my fingers. I found peace in it. Or at least I used to. "Ada." I looked up at the sound of his voice, shielding my eyes from the sun. He stood at the edge of the garden, his hands hidden inside the folds of his robe, his posture casual, though his eyes told another story. "Come with me." I wiped my hands on the apron tied around my waist. "Where?" "For a walk." I hesitated. "We're not supposed to." "We're not forbidden to," he countered. "It's just a walk, Ada." But we both knew it was not just a walk. I let out a breath, glancing over my shoulder toward the monastery. No one was watching. I stood, dusting off my skirt, and followed him. We walked past the gardens, past the stone walls that had confined my life for 4 decades, past the orchard where the sisters collected apples in the fall. Beyond that, the land stretched into wild fields, golden with summer wheat. The sky above us deepened into dusk, and for the first time in years, I felt free. Neither of us spoke for a long time. We walked side by side, our steps in sync, the world around us humming with the sounds of the evening. The wind carried the scent of earth and wildflowers, rustling the trees, stirring the fabric of my dress. Eventually, Richard broke the silence. "You weren't made for that place," he said. I glanced at him, his profile sharp against the fading light. "That place saved me," I murmured. He scoffed softly, shaking his head. "No. It trapped you. There's a difference." I exhaled. "Why do you say these things to me?" "Because I look at you, and I see someone who was meant for more than silence. Someone who was meant for love." My breath caught in my throat. "You don't belong in the monastery," he said again, quieter this time. I closed my eyes for a moment, willing myself to be unaffected by his words. But it was useless. Because I knew he was right. I turned away, wrapping my arms around myself. The wind had picked up, making me shiver. I felt him step closer. "Ada," he murmured. I did not move away when he reached for me. His fingers grazed my arm first, hesitant, before sliding down to my wrist. A pulse, a connection, a silent plea neither of us spoke aloud. I swallowed. "If you keep saying things like this, Richard, I won't know how to stay." "Maybe you shouldn't." I looked at him then, really looked at him. His face was lined with conflict, but beneath it, there was something raw. Something that felt a lot like love. I did not fight it when he pulled me closer, when his hands settled at my waist, grounding me. I exhaled slowly, pressing my forehead to his chest, listening to the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath the fabric. "This is dangerous," I whispered. "I know." But neither of us let go. And for the first time in 40 years, I wondered if I had made a mistake staying in the monastery at all. That first walk became 2, then 3. Soon, it was a routine neither of us could resist. The others never questioned it. They assumed it was a priest offering spiritual guidance to a devoted sister. And perhaps, in the beginning, That was what Richard had told himself. But there was nothing spiritual about the way his fingers sometimes lingered against mine when he handed me a book. Nothing holy about the way his voice softened when he spoke my name. And absolutely nothing godly about the way we found excuses to touch. It was always subtle, always fleeting. A brush of his hand against my lower back as he guided me through a doorway. The press of his knee against mine beneath the chapel pews. The way his fingertips skimmed the inside of my wrist when he handed me a candle in the dark. Each touch was a prayer. Each moment, a sin. And yet, neither of us could stop. One evening, as the sky burned red with the setting sun, Richard pulled me off the path and into the shadows of an old oak tree. "Ada," he murmured, his hands framing my face. I trembled beneath his touch. "I need to know," he whispered. I swallowed. "Know what?" "If you'll leave with me." The words hit me like a bolt of lightning. I stepped back, my breath quickening. "Leave?" I echoed. "Leave the monastery?" "Yes." I shook my head, my hands clenched at my sides. "Richard, Don't say no," he interrupted. "Not yet. Just think about it." I couldn't breathe. For 40 years, I had been Sister Ada. For 40 years, I had belonged to silence, to solitude, to a life I had convinced myself was the only one left for me. But when Richard looked at me like that, when his hands traced the edges of my face as if memorizing me, I felt something else. I felt like Ada. Just Ada. A woman. A woman who could still be loved. A woman who still wanted. I opened my mouth to speak, but he silenced me with a kiss. It was softer than the first time. Slower. But it carried a promise, a future I was too afraid to believe in. I kissed him back anyway, because in that moment, I wanted to believe. The nights were ours. They belonged to whispered confessions, to stolen touches beneath the cover of darkness, to Richard pressing me against the cold stone of the monastery walls, his breath hot against my neck as I sighed his name into the night, to hands that knew they should not wander but did anyway, to lips that should have only spoken prayers but instead traced the curve of my collarbone. We could not stop. We did not want to. And every time he held me, I felt it. The pull of something bigger than the monastery. Bigger than faith. Bigger than either of us. I was falling. And I was not sure if I wanted to be saved. I had thought we were careful. I had believed that our quiet moments, our hushed conversations, and the glances we stole when no one was looking would remain just that. Hidden in the shadows, known only to us. But the truth is never content to stay buried. It happened in the stillness of evening, when the air carried the scent of rain and the candles in the corridor flickered uncertainly. I had just returned to my room, my pulse still uneven, my thoughts lost in the remnants of Richard's warmth. I did not notice her at first. Not until I turned. Sister Miriam stood just beyond the doorway, half hidden in the dim glow of candlelight. Her face was unreadable, but the weight of her gaze told me she had seen more than I could deny. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, she whispered, "You have strayed." The words settled between us like a heavy stone. I knew then that there was no escape. By dawn, the air inside the convent had changed. I could feel it in the silence, in the way the others moved around me as if my presence alone disrupted the peace. No one spoke outright, but their eyes carried their judgment. Sister Miriam had told them. It was not anger that met me. Not confrontation. Instead, it was something far worse. Distance. The very women I had prayed beside for 4 decades no longer acknowledged me. They did not call my name, did not meet my eyes. In the dining hall, when I sat, the others subtly moved away. In the chapel, where once we had been united in faith, they left an empty space around me, as if I no longer belonged. The isolation was suffocating. But perhaps the worst part was knowing that they were right. Not because I regretted Richard, but because I had known this day would come. I did not seek Richard out that evening. He found me first. I had retreated to the courtyard, my hands clenched together in my lap, my gaze fixed on the sky. The wind had picked up, tugging at the edges of my veil, the last remnants of a life I could no longer claim as my own. Ada. His voice was firm, steady, yet beneath it I heard something else. Anger. Not at me. At them. At the way they had turned their backs. At the way they had cast me out without a word. You can't stay here, he said. I exhaled slowly, closing my eyes. Where would I go? With me, he answered. I'll take you somewhere safe. I turned to him, my throat tight. Richard. Don't say no. His voice was quieter now, as if afraid of what I might choose. You don't have to live like this. Not anymore. I looked at him then, really looked at him. At the man who had given me back the piece of myself I had long since buried. And I knew. I had no home here. But I had him. And for the first time in 40 years, that was enough. Richard's house was old, settled deep in the quiet countryside outside the city. It had stood the test of time, its wooden walls marked by history, its windows worn by the wind. When we arrived, I stepped inside hesitantly, my fingers grazing the doorframe. The scent of aged wood and faded books filled the air, a warmth settling in my chest as I took in my surroundings. It felt familiar. Not the home I had once shared with Ryan. Something older. It reminded me of the house where I had grown up, the place where I had first learned the sound of rain on the roof, where I had once danced barefoot in the kitchen as a child, where life had felt open, untouched by sorrow. Richard watched me carefully. Does it feel strange? He asked. I shook my head. No. It feels like I was always meant to be here. His lips quirked into a small, knowing smile. Then stay. Outside the monastery, everything was different. Richard no longer carried the same restraint in his eyes. He no longer hesitated before reaching for my hand, no longer kept his distance when we stood too close. And I no longer felt the weight of guilt pressing against my ribs. The first evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, I stood by the window, watching the world bathed in gold. The air smelled of summer, of earth still warm from the day's heat. Richard stepped behind me, his presence unmistakable. Ada, he murmured, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. I turned to face him, my breath catching. For so long, we had lived in shadows, in stolen moments. But now, in this house, in this new life, there were no longer rules to bind us. And it was that thought, the freedom of it, that made my pulse quicken. When he reached for me, I did not move away. His hands settled at my waist, his grip both gentle and certain. I let myself lean into him, resting my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Do you regret it? He asked quietly. I knew what he meant. Leaving. Everything. I tilted my head, meeting his gaze. Not for a second. Something in his eyes darkened, something deep, something filled with unspoken words. And then, slowly, he lifted a hand to my face, his fingers brushing along my cheek before settling beneath my jaw. You are the strongest woman I have ever known, he whispered. I smiled, my fingers grazing his wrist. And you are the only man who ever made me believe I could be something more. The moment stretched between us, thick with something neither of us could name. Then, with quiet certainty, he leaned in, pressing his forehead to mine. And for the first time in decades, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The days melted into one another, slow and golden. Richard and I would walk through the fields in the mornings, our hands brushing as we spoke of everything and nothing. In the afternoons, I would sit by the window with a book, listening to the sound of his footsteps moving through the house. And at night, when the world grew quiet, he would pull me into his arms, his touch steady, his embrace warm. I had spent so long feeling lost. But here in this house, I was found. Not just by Richard, but by myself. For the first time in years, I felt young again, not in body, but in spirit. It did not matter that time had carved lines into my skin, that my hair had begun to streak with silver. Richard looked at me as if I was still the woman who had first caught his eye in the monastery garden, as if the years between us had never passed. And when he kissed me, When he whispered my name like it was something sacred, I knew. This was my second chance. This was the life I had never dared to dream of. And I would not waste a single moment of it.